people think revenge is loud. A screaming match, a thrown glass, or a dramatic confrontation in the pouring rain. But in my experience, true revenge is absolutely silent. It is the sound of a classified manila folder sliding across a polished desk. It is the quiet hum of the air conditioner while I stare at the name of the man who spent 4 years trying to ruin my marriage, realizing that with one signature I can destroy his life. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Allison Ferguson. I am 42 years old and I serve as the director of the Defense Logistics Integrity Bureau. You will not find us on any public government directory. We are a supreme phantom military auditing agency based out of San Diego, California, operating entirely in the shadows. My daily reality involves dissecting defense contracts worth billions of dollars. Within those highly classified walls, I hold absolute power. With a single calculated stroke of my pen, I can vaporize a massive weapons corporation or send a decorated 3-star general straight to a federal prison cell. But the moment I pull into my own driveway, my authority is completely stripped away. At home, I am simply the new wife. My marriage to Marcus, a wonderful man of 52 whom I love with my entire being, is a sanctuary that is constantly suffocated by a dark, lingering shadow. That shadow is Julian. He is Marcus's 25-year-old son from his previous marriage and a newly minted Navy lieutenant with an ego significantly larger than an aircraft carrier. Last night, during what was supposed to be a quiet family dinner, the air in our dining room grew thick and unbearable once again. "So how is the tedious paperwork coming along, Allison?" Julian asked, a condescending smirk playing on his lips as he lazily swirled his glass of red wine. "Are you still counting the government's loose change? Honestly, Dad, I still do not understand why you let your wife work that pathetic desk jockey job. It is not like she actually needs to work, right? The moment she stepped foot into this house, she practically secured an unlimited pass to your bank accounts." He openly called me a gold digger right at the dinner table, chewing his steak with a look of pure disdain. Marcus frowned deeply, his jaw tightening as he opened his mouth to reprimand his son. But before he could speak, I placed my hand on my husband's arm and gave it a gentle, reassuring squeeze. I chose to smile. It was a faint, polite smile devoid of any anger. I did not utter a single word of defense. I simply sat back and let Julian drown in the hollow pride of a young, arrogant officer who genuinely believed he was untouchable. I knew that arguing with a boy who wore his uniform like a superhero cape was a waste of my breath. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I sat in my spacious, soundproof office at the Bureau headquarters. The contrast was stark. There was no shouting here, no petty domestic squabbles, and certainly no disrespectful children. There was only absolute clinical professionalism. The profound silence of the room was broken only by the soft click of the heavy oak door as my lead investigator stepped inside. Without speaking a single word, he placed a thick, sealed internal criminal investigation file directly in the center of my polished desk and walked out. I broke the red security seal and flipped open the heavy cover. The breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. The very first wave of shock hit me without any warning. Printed in bold, stark black ink across the top of the suspect profile was a name I knew entirely too well: Lieutenant Julian Ferguson. Below his smug military portrait was a terrifying list of charges that could end a man's freedom forever. He was formally accused of being the primary mastermind behind a highly sophisticated illicit ring actively smuggling military drone equipment worth millions of dollars straight into the international black market. I sat there in the heavy silence of my office, the air suddenly feeling exceptionally thin. Staring down at the indictment, a chaotic storm of emotions surged through my chest. On one hand, an intoxicating wave of vindication washed over me. Here was my chance. I could simply let the system crush him. I could step aside, watch the military tribunal strip away his precious rank, and finally enjoy the revenge I had silently craved after enduring years of endless humiliation. I would not have to lift a single finger. I could just let gravity do the work. But on the other hand, there was the ironclad oath I had sworn. I had dedicated 20 long years to protecting the integrity of the defense infrastructure. Letting a petty personal vendetta blind me would make me no better than the corrupt defense contractors I hunted down every single day. I picked up my secure phone and dialed a direct line to the Pentagon. I formally reported the familial connection to my superiors, laying bare my relationship with the suspect to ensure complete transparency. The response from the four-star admiral on the other end of the encrypted line was absolute. Because of the hyper-classified nature of the investigation and the undeniable fact that our Bureau's analytical capabilities were completely unmatched, they flatly refused to reassign the case. My objectivity had never once been questioned in my entire career. I was explicitly ordered to proceed and lead the financial data analysis of the crime. I locked my heavy oak door, initiated a Level 5 secure network protocol, and dove straight into the raw data. The numbers flowed across my 3 monitors, glowing with a cold, unforgiving light. The evidence was absolutely damning. According to the digital logs, his electronic identification badge had swiped into the restricted logistics bays on 12 separate occasions outside of normal operating hours. His cryptographic signature was stamped across 47 different inventory release forms, authorizing the transfer of highly classified surveillance drones. Every single timestamp, every geographical tag, and every biometric login matched his profile flawlessly. As I scrutinized a fraudulent invoice for $850,000, an old memory forcefully pushed its way into my mind. It was from a 4th of July barbecue exactly 2 years ago. He had been holding a cold beer surrounded by a group of wide-eyed junior recruits, proudly wearing his freshly pressed uniform. The United States Armed Forces are not sustained by paper pushers, he had boasted loudly, ensuring his voice carried all the way to where I was standing near the grill. Wars are won by exceptional individuals, men who are willing to bleed in the dirt. We are the tip of the spear. We absolutely do not answer to the cowards sitting in air-conditioned rooms, counting the government's loose change. I shook the bitter memory away and narrowed my eyes at the glowing screen. Yes, the evidence pointed a loaded gun directly at his head. But through the seasoned lens of a forensic auditor, something felt fundamentally wrong. When you spend 80 hours a week dissecting financial crimes, you begin to understand the complex psychological profiles of the criminals behind them. Arrogant people are by their very nature careless. They believe they are inherently smarter than the system, which always makes them sloppy. The young man I knew left his dirty socks on the living room floor. He consistently forgot to lock his car doors. He had never once bothered to read a single credit card statement before haphazardly swiping it to buy expensive watches. Yet the digital footprint laid out before me was an absolute masterpiece of evasion. The illicit funds were routed through 17 distinct offshore accounts, washed through a decentralized cryptocurrency mixer, and reinvested into untraceable shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. The logistics records had been altered using advanced backdoor bypasses that required a deep systemic understanding of naval supply chain architecture. It was simply too clean. Every single loose end had been meticulously tied off, leaving exactly one glaringly obvious suspect. The transactions were vastly too sophisticated for an arrogant junior officer who could barely balance his own personal checking account. He lacked the discipline, the patience, and frankly the intellect to orchestrate a $5 million international smuggling operation without leaving a massive trail of stupid impulsive mistakes. I leaned back in my dark leather chair, the blue glow of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. This was not a profile of a young lieutenant getting greedy. This was a flawless, terrifying setup. Someone was playing a much larger game, manipulating the board from the deep shadows and using my foolish stepson as the perfect disposable scapegoat. The real work began the moment I realized the entire case was a meticulously constructed illusion. I sealed myself inside the subterranean secure zone of the Bureau, plunging into a grueling routine of 80-hour work weeks. The outside world completely ceased to exist. My reality narrowed down to the glowing blue light of my monitors and the chaotic web of digital financial trails. I was hunting a ghost through a labyrinth of international banking networks. The stolen defense funds had been scattered to the wind, but every transaction leaves a shadow. I relentlessly tracked the phantom money through a maze of dummy corporations, pushing past encrypted banking firewalls and unmasking offshore trusts hidden across the globe. I cross-referenced thousands of shipping manifests with satellite imagery of international cargo ports, hunting for discrepancies in the gross tonnage of vessels departing from the western seaboard. It was a high-stakes game of political chess, and the opponent I was tracking possessed a terrifying level of systemic access. While I was quietly dismantling the financial smokescreen from the shadows, the fragile situation outside completely detonated. A classified leak breached the internal containment protocols of the Department of Defense. The military justice system does not wait for absolute certainty. It moves with the brutal, crushing efficiency of a war machine. The sudden suspension of a commissioned officer is designed to be psychologically devastating, and command acted immediately to ensure maximum visibility. Without a single warning, my stepson was abruptly suspended from all active duties. 2 heavily armed military police officers marched directly into his quarters in the middle of the day. They aggressively stripped him of his sidearm, unceremoniously confiscated the security badges from his uniform, and escorted him off the naval base in front of dozens of his whispering peers. The invincible young officer who thought he owned the world was suddenly powerless, thrown into an absolute state of panic and public humiliation. He was effectively a prisoner in his own life, waiting for the heavy hammer of military justice to completely obliterate his future. That evening, the heavy oak front door of our house flew open with enough violent force to crack the plaster on the wall. He stormed into the living room like a wild, cornered animal. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot with sheer terror, and his chest heaved with frantic, uncontrolled breaths. He spotted me standing near the fireplace and immediately pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "This is your doing, is it not?" he screamed, his voice cracking with a toxic mixture of rage and overwhelming fear. "You have always hated me. You used your pathetic, shadowy government connections to frame me for this. You want me out of the picture so you can hoard my father's wealth all to yourself. You are deliberately trying to send me to a federal penitentiary." Marcus completely broke down. My strong, dependable husband collapsed onto the living room sofa, burying his face deep into his trembling hands. He was utterly paralyzed by the nightmare unfolding inside his own home. He was trapped in an impossible, agonizing crossfire, standing helpless between the wife he loved and his only child, who was now staring down the terrifying barrel of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security military prison. The weight of the impending destruction was crushing the very soul out of him. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, and my expression completely unreadable. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I did not offer a single syllable of justification or defense. Let him scream until his lungs gave out. Let him hurl every vicious accusation his panicked mind could invent. Arguing with a drowning man only pulls you under the water with him. I simply picked up my heavy trench coat, turned my back on his frantic shouting, and walked out the front door. I drove straight through the dead of the night, returning to the absolute silence of the Bureau. I had one final locked door to breach. I initiated a highly aggressive brute force decryption protocol, targeting a restricted naval logistics server that had supposedly been permanently wiped clean 6 months prior. The data recovery process was agonizingly slow, testing the absolute limits of our supercomputers. I sat in the darkness watching the decryption progress bar crawl forward for 9 grueling hours. But right as the morning sun began to pierce the heavy fog over the Pacific Ocean, the fortified firewall finally shattered. The resurrected digital logs flooded my main screen. There it was, the absolute, undeniable proof I had been hunting for. I found the hidden administrator protocol that had been quietly authorizing the illicit drone shipments and perfectly forging the electronic signatures of the young lieutenant. I rapidly ran a cross-reference on the master access terminal, tracing the unique digital fingerprint back to its true source. The owner of that digital footprint did not belong to a careless junior officer. It belonged to a man wielding a Level 7 security clearance. The name flashing on my screen was Colonel Vance. He was the direct commanding officer of the naval base. The very man my stepson idolized with absolute devotion, viewing him as an infallible mentor and a second father. This was the superior officer who constantly praised the boy's exceptional leadership skills, who proudly pinned the lieutenant bars on his uniform, and who frequently invited him to private dinners. The honorable decorated Colonel Vance was the undisputed mastermind of the entire multi-million-dollar smuggling ring. He had been systematically siphoning military assets for years, and when the auditing heat began to rise, he methodically laid down a flawless breadcrumb trail of forged evidence, pointing directly at his most arrogant, careless subordinate. It was an act of breathtaking betrayal. The colonel was using the boy he pretended to mentor as the ultimate disposable sacrifice to save his own skin. Discovering the terrifying truth about the true mastermind was only the beginning of an incredibly steep uphill battle. The undeniable evidence linking the esteemed colonel to the massive smuggling ring was not something I could simply print out on a piece of paper and hand over to a military tribunal. It was buried deep beneath labyrinthine layers of military-grade encryption and guarded by impossibly complex access protocols. If I prematurely submitted a standard investigative report to the Pentagon at that very moment, it would be akin to signing my own professional death warrant. A man possessing his towering rank and sprawling political reach would instantly leverage his vast network of high-level connections. Within 24 hours, he could easily have the raw data seized under the convenient guise of national security order, the sensitive server logs permanently scrubbed from existence, and deliberately fast-track the court-martial against the boy, before I could even file a formal appeal. I was trapped in a high-stakes staring contest on the absolute edge of an abyss, facing a seasoned predator who had the entire military apparatus at his disposal. He was certainly not a passive opponent. The colonel possessed the sharp, paranoid instincts of a survivor, and he could feel the bureaucratic pressure shifting beneath his feet. He quickly sensed that my agency was digging far past the shallow grave he had so carefully prepared for his junior officer. Soon the invisible pushback began. It started as subtle, frustrating institutional resistance. My team's access requests to routine naval logistical databases were suddenly and inexplicably denied. Standard shipping manifests from the past 48 months were abruptly reclassified to the highest security tiers. Then the resistance escalated into direct, chilling intimidation. Anonymous, heavily encrypted digital messages began appearing on my secure office terminal at all hours of the night. They contained thinly veiled warnings about the severe dangers of civilian auditors overstepping their jurisdictional boundaries. One particular message explicitly advised the unknown director of the Bureau to completely close the investigation within 48 hours for the sake of interdepartmental harmony or risk facing a devastating congressional inquiry into our annual funding. He was using every single ounce of his considerable political capital to suffocate my team and bury the truth. But the sheer delicious irony of the situation was almost poetic. This untouchable military titan was desperately trying to intimidate a faceless, nameless director, completely oblivious to the extraordinary fact that the phantom hunting him from the shadows was the very woman sitting at the dinner table with his chosen sacrificial lamb. Back at our house, the atmosphere had rapidly deteriorated from volatile rage into a suffocating, unbearable despair. The fierce anger had entirely burned out of the young lieutenant, leaving nothing but cold gray ashes. I watched silently from the hallway shadow as he sat slumped on the hardwood floor of his bedroom, completely surrounded by empty amber bottles of cheap whiskey. The crisp, immaculate uniform he used to wear like a second skin was thrown carelessly into a dark corner, discarded like worthless garbage. He had not showered or shaved in 3 days. For the very first time in his privileged, incredibly sheltered 25 years of life, he was tasting the bitter metallic reality of absolute powerlessness. He was staring directly into the terrifying void of a completely ruined future, finally realizing that his own monumental arrogance had provided the exact rope his beloved commander was now using to hang him. There were no more insults hurled in my direction. There were no more arrogant smirks or condescending remarks about my pathetic desk job. There was only the agonizing heavy silence of a broken boy realizing he was nothing more than a disposable pawn waiting to be swept off the board. I refused to let a corrupt officer win this silent war. If a direct frontal assault was strategically impossible, I would have to weave an inescapable snare using the only weapon I trusted implicitly. I turned to the dry, unyielding language of forensic accounting. Over the course of 72 grueling hours, I quietly engineered a lethal digital blind spot within the military banking network. I systematically manipulated the very audit protocols I had helped author a decade ago, crafting a temporary, highly localized vacuum within the financial tracking software. It was an ingenious trap that would only snap shut if someone wielding a Level 7 security clearance attempted to actively sever the final connection between the offshore Cayman accounts and the domestic naval logistics servers. It was the digital equivalent of a tripwire attached to a massive landmine. I did not need to break into his fortified vault. I simply needed to leave the door completely unlocked and wait for him to walk through and cut the wire himself. To successfully lure a paranoid predator out of the thick brush, you have to offer him the exact meal he is hunting for. I meticulously drafted a highly official, heavily redacted preliminary summary and forwarded it through the secure communication channels directly to his command element. The document formally indicated that my agency had completed 95% of the audit and found absolutely zero evidence of external manipulation. It explicitly stated we were prepared to fully concur with the initial findings that the lieutenant acted entirely alone and was the sole architect of the multi-million-dollar smuggling operation. I handed him the absolute certainty of his own flawless victory. I gave him the peace of mind he desperately craved. The very next morning, capitalizing on his relaxed guard, I issued a formal, undeniable mandate. I demanded a mandatory closed-door adjudication hearing to be held at the naval base. I stipulated, citing strict procedural compliance, that all involved personnel, specifically including the direct commanding officer, must be physically present in the room to sign the final disposition paperwork and officially close the inquiry forever. The board was set. The pieces were locked into place. The final collision was entirely inevitable. The morning of the hearing arrived with a thick, oppressive fog rolling in off the Pacific coast, blanketing the city of San Diego in a suffocating gray haze. It was fitting weather for an execution. I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, methodically buttoning my sharpest, most impeccably tailored charcoal black suit. It was the armor I wore when I needed to dismantle empires. I snapped the silver clasps of my leather briefcase shut, sealing the true unredacted financial report inside. That single stack of paper held the absolute power to detonate a spectacular military career and completely reshape the balance of power within this naval sector. I walked downstairs into the kitchen where Marcus was sitting at the island, staring blankly into a cold cup of coffee. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single week, the heavy bags under his eyes a testament to his sleepless agony. I walked up behind him, rested my hands gently on his tense shoulders, and leaned down. "Trust me," I whispered softly, leaving no room for questions before turning and walking out the door. Inside the heavily fortified walls of the naval base, the grand adjudication chamber was freezing and entirely devoid of mercy. It was a massive room built from dark mahogany and polished brass, designed specifically to make anyone standing in its center feel utterly insignificant. Julian was the first to take his place at the defendant's table. His face was the color of chalk, drained of every single drop of his former arrogance. He sat rigidly in his wooden chair, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his lap. In his mind, this was the absolute end of his life. He was fully preparing himself to be formally stripped of his rank, publicly humiliated, and marched directly into a military tribunal where he would face a minimum of 2 decades behind steel bars. A few moments later, Colonel Vance strode into the room, his chest puffed out proudly, his rows of commendation medals gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He took his designated seat at the witness stand, immediately adopting the practiced sorrowful expression of a deeply disappointed father figure. He projected the perfect image of a heartbroken commander, forced to watch a promising subordinate destroy his own future. He even offered a heavy, solemn sigh as he glanced over at the shattered young man he had systematically framed, shaking his head in mock disbelief at the tragedy of it all. It was a sickeningly flawless performance. At exactly 9 o'clock, the high-ranking generals of the Military Oversight Board filed into the room, their faces stern and unyielding. They took their elevated seats behind the massive curved desk at the front of the chamber. However, there was one glaring anomaly in the room. The chair positioned at the center table, reserved specifically for the lead investigator of the independent auditing agency, remained conspicuously empty. The presiding admiral checked his watch and frowned. The heavy silence stretching on and pulling the tension in the room so tight it threatened to snap. The board was ready to drop the guillotine, but they needed the final executioner to arrive. Then the heavy brass handles of the chamber doors turned. The thick wooden panels swung open with a resounding thud that echoed ominously off the high ceiling. Every eye in the room snapped toward the entrance. I stepped across the threshold. The sharp rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble floor was the only sound piercing the dead silence. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my gaze fixed directly ahead as I walked straight down the center aisle. Julian slowly lifted his head. When his hollow eyes registered my face, his entire body flinched violently as if he had been struck by an invisible physical blow. His jaw went completely slack. He stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock, unable to comprehend why the civilian stepmother he had endlessly mocked as a useless gold digger was suddenly striding into a highly classified military tribunal. From the witness stand, Colonel Vance narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the unknown woman intruding on his perfect, undisputed victory. He adjusted his collar, a microscopic flicker of unease crossing his confident face, as I deliberately placed my leather briefcase onto the empty table and took my seat. The presiding admiral struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp crack shattering the heavy silence. He cleared his throat and looked directly at the young lieutenant. "Let the record show that the board is now fully assembled," the admiral announced, his voice booming across the grand chamber. "I would like to formally introduce the council to Director Allison Ferguson, the supreme head of the Defense Logistics Integrity Bureau. She holds the absolute, unquestionable authority to determine the final conclusion of this investigation." I slowly turned my head and met Julian's gaze. His breathing stopped completely, the horrific realization finally crashing down upon him that the pathetic desk jockey he had relentlessly despised now held his entire existence in the palm of her hand. I stood up from the center table and walked directly to the podium facing the High Oversight Council. I did not cast a single glance in the lieutenant's direction. I connected my secure hard drive to the primary console. With a sharp click, the massive screens dominating the walls of the chamber flared to life. I began to methodically tear apart the meticulously forged narrative the colonel had constructed. My voice was completely void of emotion, slicing through the heavy air of the room like a surgical scalpel. I did not deal in theories or accusations. I dealt in absolute, indisputable mathematics. I brought up a complex orbital schematic illustrating how a deliberate blind spot had been engineered into the communication satellites hovering above the Pacific Fleet. I explained in agonizing detail how those artificial communication blackouts perfectly coincided with a massive stream of digital currency routing through decentralized exchanges. Then I executed the final command. The tangled web of financial data on the giant screens resolved into a single crystal-clear ledger. It displayed a direct, undeniable transfer of $3,200,000. The receiving offshore account did not belong to the terrified boy sitting at the defense table. The digital signature explicitly belonged to the man sitting in the witness stand time-stamped a mere 48 hours ago. I turned my head very slowly and locked eyes with the colonel. The arrogant, self-satisfied smirk that had been plastered across his face completely evaporated. The color drained from his cheeks as the horrifying reality of his situation set in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had been utterly destroyed by a nameless, invisible civilian desk clerk. The presiding admiral slammed his gavel down, shouting orders over the sudden eruption of chaotic noise in the chamber. Two heavily armored military police officers immediately flanked the witness stand. They hauled the commanding officer to his feet, forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back, and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He was dragged out of the chamber in absolute disgrace. Down at the defense table, Julian collapsed forward. He buried his face in his trembling hands and began to weep openly. His shoulders shook with violent gasping sobs of pure relief. The crushing weight of a 20-year prison sentence had just been miraculously lifted from his shoulders. He looked up at me through his tears, his eyes overflowing with immense gratitude. He truly believed that his wealthy, powerful stepmother had swooped in to save him. He thought I was going to completely wipe his slate clean and let him walk out of those heavy brass doors as the same arrogant officer he had been yesterday. He was entirely mistaken. I turned my full, unyielding attention toward the young man. There was absolutely no soft maternal forgiveness in my eyes. I picked up the thick, heavy manila folder containing his original indictment and slammed it down onto the wooden desk with a violent crack that echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing the remaining whispers in the room. "Lieutenant Ferguson," I said, my voice echoing with terrifying authority, "the undeniable truth is that you were framed. However, the far greater truth is that you handed them the exact weapon they used to destroy you. It was your monumental arrogance that created this vulnerability. It was your inherent laziness. It was your incredibly reckless habit of blindly signing highly classified logistical transfer documents without ever bothering to read a single line of text. You believed that your uniform made you inherently superior to the vital processes that keep this military functioning." I watched him shrink back into his chair, the brief flicker of hope dying in his eyes. An officer who has zero respect for the meticulous details, who openly despises the fundamental rules of operation, is just as dangerous to the United States Navy as the corrupt commanders who actively steal from it, I continued mercilessly. Using my supreme authority as director, I delivered his final verdict. I formally revoked his eligibility for any rank promotion for a period of exactly 5 years. Furthermore, I ordered his immediate transfer to the absolute lowest tier of logistical maintenance, stationed at the most isolated, grueling naval supply depot in the country. I had effectively saved him from rotting in a federal penitentiary, but I made absolutely certain to completely obliterate the fragile, inflated ego of that young officer. 6 long months passed. The grand, silent halls of the Bureau headquarters remained exactly as they always were. Late one evening, a sharp, firm knock sounded against my heavy oak door. It opened slowly. Julian stepped inside. He was no longer wearing his crisp, immaculate officer dress uniform adorned with shiny gold bars. He was wearing standard-issue mechanic coveralls, heavily stained with dark grease and motor oil after a grueling 12-hour shift. His hands, which used to lazily swirl expensive wine, were heavily calloused and bruised.